I didn't expect my own body to call me out like that. One second I was walking across my living room, the next I was frozen in place with this sharp, heavy pressure right in the center of my chest. It wasn't dramatic like in the movies. No collapsing, no gasping for air. Just a quiet, terrifying pain that made me wonder how close I was to becoming a headline no one wanted to read. I stood there, gripping the edge of the table, trying to act like I had it under control. But the truth is, I was scared. Really scared. There was this voice in the back of my mind whispering, "What if this is it? What if no one finds you until tomorrow?" And as embarrassing as it is to admit, that thought hit harder than the pain itself. When the pressure finally eased, I just sat down on the floor. No finesse, no dignity. Just me and the reality I'd been dodging for years. My heart had been trying to get my attention in quieter ways. The breathlessness on the stairs, the constant fatigue, that tightness I kept blaming on stress. But that night, it stopped asking. Demanded. And I remember thinking, is this my last warning? Is this the moment when I either change something or lose everything? I didn't say it out loud, but the question hung there, heavy and cold, like the room was waiting for my answer. And looking back now, that moment wasn't even the real turning point. It was only the beginning. I wish I could say it happened overnight, that one day I just woke up heavier and exhausted. But the truth is, it crept up on me the same way bad habits always do. I kept telling myself I was just busy, just tired, just going through a phase. Meanwhile, every late-night meal and every skipped morning turned into another layer I didn't want to admit was there. What hurt the most wasn't the weight itself. It was how small my world became without me realizing it. I stopped going out with friends because I didn't want to squeeze into booths at restaurants. I avoided photos like they were traps. Somewhere along the way, I started choosing comfort over connection, and food became the one thing that didn't judge me. There were days when I'd walk past a mirror and catch a glimpse of someone I didn't recognize. I'd look away so fast it was almost instinct. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was this quiet shame that settled deep in my chest, a feeling that I'd let myself drift too far from the person I used to be. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to turn back. I kept telling myself I was fine, that everyone goes through rough patches. But deep down I knew the truth. I wasn't living, I was numbing. Every night ended the same way. Me sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, pretending I wasn't lonely, pretending I wasn't falling apart a little more each day. I didn't say it out loud, but I think a part of me had already given up. And yet, even then, I had no idea how much lower things would go before anything truly changed. It got to the point where I built my whole day around avoiding people. I'd plan my grocery runs for late at night, hope no one I knew was around, and pray I wouldn't run into anyone from my past. It wasn't paranoia. It was this quiet fear that someone would look at me too long and see everything I'd been trying so hard to hide. Work wasn't any easier. I kept my head down, stayed at my desk, pretended to be busy even when all I really wanted was to disappear. The small comments people made, those just joking remarks, stuck with me more than I ever admitted. I'd laugh them off in the moment, but on the drive home, they'd replay like little reminders of how far I'd fallen. What surprised me most was how heavy everyday tasks started to feel. Not physically, emotionally. Sending a simple text back felt like work. Making plans felt impossible. I convinced myself people were better off without me showing up. Somewhere deep inside, I started believing I didn't deserve to take up space, and that belief settled into me like a weight I couldn't shake. There were evenings when I'd sit in my car in the driveway, staring at the steering wheel because I couldn't find the energy to walk inside. It wasn't depression in the dramatic sense. It was more like I was fading out piece by piece and nobody noticed. Or maybe they did, and I just didn't have the courage to find out. But even then, I still told myself I was managing. I clung to that word like it meant something. I didn't realize I was one more bad moment away from everything collapsing. And that moment came sooner than I expected. I remember sitting in my car after that appointment, keys still in my hand, engine off, just stuck. It felt like the whole world had narrowed down to one sentence, and I couldn't outrun it this time. I kept replaying the doctor's tone. Calm, matter-of-fact, almost too gentle for something that hit me like a punch. Part of me wanted to believe he was exaggerating, but another part knew he wasn't even close to dramatic enough. The drive home felt unreal. Every stoplight made me painfully aware of my heartbeat, like I was suddenly listening to a part of my body I had ignored for years. I kept wondering how many warnings I'd missed, how many chances I'd shrugged off because I thought I was too busy or too young to worry. The truth was, I wasn't scared of dying. I was scared of dying like this, in a life that didn't feel like mine anymore. Walking into my apartment didn't feel comforting like it used to. The place looked the same, but something in me had shifted. I caught myself scanning the room, noticing all the little habits I'd built. Takeout containers on the counter, half-finished snacks, the couch that had practically molded to my shape. It was like I was looking at the home of someone who'd been hiding from his own life. I sat on the edge of my bed, not crying, not panicking, just sitting with this heavy reality pressing into me. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was this quiet awareness that I'd been treating my body like an afterthought, expecting it to carry everything I didn't want to deal with. And now it was finally speaking in a language I couldn't ignore. A part of me wanted to make a plan right there, decide who I'd become starting tomorrow. But honestly, I didn't trust myself. I'd promised tomorrow way too many times. All I knew was that something had cracked open inside me, something I couldn't tape back together with excuses. And that's when the real shift began, long before I even understood it. The next morning, I didn't wake up with some heroic surge of motivation. It was more like this quiet, stubborn thought that wouldn't leave me alone. I put on an old pair of sneakers, ones I hadn't touched in months, and stepped outside before I could talk myself out of it. The air felt colder than I expected, and for a second I wondered what the hell I was doing. I started slow, telling myself it was just a loop around the block. Nothing ambitious. But halfway through, my chest tightened. Not the scary kind from the night before, just the kind that reminded me how long I'd been out of my own life. My legs felt heavy, my breath uneven, and part of me wanted to turn back. Yet there was something strangely grounding about it, like each step was a small argument against the version of myself I'd been living with. By the time I reached the corner, my heart was pounding harder than I liked. I leaned against a fence, pretending to stretch so I wouldn't look ridiculous if anyone drove by. That's when it hit me. This was the first time in years I'd actually felt present inside my own body. Not hiding from it. Not numbing it. Just being there. I didn't finish the full loop. I won't pretend I pushed through. I turned around early and walked home slower than I'd left. But even in that short walk, something softened in me. I realized how close I'd come to losing all of this. The simple ability to move, to breathe outside, to feel my heart working for me instead of against me. When I got back to my apartment, I stood there with my hand on the doorknob, slightly sweaty, slightly embarrassed, but also strangely proud. It wasn't a victory by anyone else's standards. But to me, in that moment, it felt like the first time I'd told myself the truth. I wasn't done yet. And that tiny shift, as small as it was, started leading me somewhere I never expected. The moment I stood in front of that mirror, something felt different. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just honest. I wasn't looking at the tired face I'd been avoiding for years. I was looking at someone who was finally asking for a little dignity. And that realization hit me harder than the doctor's warning ever did. I didn't suddenly love what I saw. Far from it. But for the first time, I wasn't staring with disgust or disappointment. There was this quiet curiosity instead, like I was meeting myself again after a long absence. I caught myself thinking, almost whispering in my own head, "You deserve better than this." And it felt strange because I wasn't used to giving myself anything gentle. I stood there longer than I expected, tracing the small details I'd ignored. The stress lines on my forehead, the puffiness under my eyes, the way my shoulders curved inward like I was trying to make myself smaller. It wasn't self-criticism, it was recognition. It was seeing the version of me that had carried everything I was too afraid to face. And somewhere in the middle of that moment, I realized how long I'd been demanding strength from a body I barely respected. I kept asking it to hold the weight of my stress, my loneliness, my disappointments. Yet I never once paused to acknowledge the person living under all of it. The thought made my chest feel tight again. Not the scary kind this time, but the emotional kind, the kind that comes when you finally hear something your heart has been trying to tell you for years. I wasn't chasing a number on a scale. I wasn't trying to look like anyone else. I just wanted to feel like I mattered. Even to myself. I walked away from the mirror feeling unsettled but awake, like a part of me had finally decided to show up. I didn't know what to do next, or how long this feeling would last. But I knew this much. Once you see yourself differently, you can't unsee it. And that's when things started to shift. Those first few days felt strangely fragile, like I was carrying around a new version of myself that could fall apart at any moment. I didn't overhaul my life or make some bold declaration. I just started paying attention, to the moments when I usually checked out, to the habits that had quietly taken over. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't let myself slip into autopilot. Switching the soda for water wasn't some grand achievement, but it surprised me how different it felt to make a choice that didn't hurt me. Same with going to bed a little earlier. It wasn't discipline, it was mercy. I realized how many nights I'd stayed up scrolling, hoping distraction would make the emptiness quieter. Going to sleep earlier didn't solve anything, but it took the edge off in a way I didn't expect. The hardest part was noticing the moments when I'd reach for food out of habit, not hunger. Those were the moments that made me pause. Not because I was judging myself, but because I finally understood what I'd been trying to numb. Stress from work, loneliness, the feeling of being stuck in a life that didn't look like mine anymore. Every time I stopped myself, even just for a second, it felt like I was slowly untangling something inside. None of it was heroic. No one cheered, no one noticed, and honestly I liked it that way. These little changes felt personal, almost private, like small promises I was making to myself. And with each one I felt a tiny spark of trust return. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I could rely on myself again. Some nights, I'd sit on the edge of the bed, exhausted but proud, because I'd gotten through the day without abandoning myself. It was a quiet kind of victory, the kind you don't post about, the kind that stays with you long after the moment passes. And as small as those choices were, they ended up opening a door I didn't expect, one that would change everything that came after. The changes were so small at first that I almost missed them. One morning I pulled on a shirt I hadn't worn in months, fully prepared for the usual tightness, and it just slipped on. Not loose, not baggy, just not fighting me the way it used to. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, relief that didn't come with a side of self-judgment. Walking up the stairs at work felt different too. I wasn't gasping at the top or pretending to check my phone to catch my breath. It was subtle, almost sneaky, like my body was finally cooperating after years of silent protest. I caught myself smiling halfway through the day, and it didn't feel forced. It felt earned. There was this one moment that really stuck with me. I was carrying groceries from the car, something that used to knock the wind out of me, and halfway to my door I realized I wasn't struggling. I wasn't bracing myself or taking a break halfway up the walkway. I was just doing it. And that simple realization hit me harder than any milestone could have. But it wasn't just the physical stuff. Something inside me felt lighter too. I caught myself humming while brushing my teeth, which sounds ridiculous, but it was the first sign that I wasn't living under that heavy fog anymore. I started noticing little joys again. The warmth of morning sunlight, the quiet of my apartment at night, the way my mood didn't crash the second something went wrong. For the first time in years I felt like I was returning to myself. Slowly, cautiously, almost shyly. I didn't trust the feeling yet, but I wanted to. And wanting it was new. Wanting it felt powerful. But I had no idea what was coming next. I didn't plan on making some big statement that day. Just happened. My coworker poked his head over the cubicle wall, gave me that familiar smile, the one he always used right before dropping extra work on my desk, and asked if I could just handle a few things for him. Normally, I would have said yes before he even finished the sentence. But something in me hesitated. Not out of anger, not out of spite, just this quiet clarity I'd never felt before. I looked at him, took a breath and said, "I can't take that on today." No apology. No explanation. Just the truth. His face froze for a second, like he wasn't sure he'd heard me right. I expected guilt to hit me immediately. That old familiar wave that always came whenever I tried to set a boundary. But it didn't. Instead, I felt this warmth in my chest. Steady, grounded, almost peaceful. It wasn't about the task I refused. It was about finally recognizing that my time, my energy, my well-being actually mattered. For the rest of the day, I kept waiting for the shame to creep in. Never did. What surprised me most was how small the moment looked from the outside. And how huge it felt on the inside. It was like telling myself, you're worth protecting, and actually believing it for once. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection in the mirror again. Not searching for progress. Not judging. Just seeing someone who didn't shrink himself to make life easier for everyone else. And the strange part. Felt proud. Proud in a way that didn't depend on a number, or an achievement, or anyone else's approval. It wasn't about becoming a different person. It was about returning to someone I should have been taking care of all along. Person with limits. Person with value. A person who could finally say no without apologizing for existing. But looking back now, that moment was only the beginning. What surprised me most wasn't how my body changed. It was how my mind stopped feeling like a battlefield. For the first time in years, my thoughts weren't turning against me every time I made a mistake or had a bad day. There was a softness in me now, a kind of patience I didn't know I was capable of. It felt strange at first, like I was wearing someone else's life, but slowly it became mine. I started noticing emotions I used to bury as soon as they appeared. Irritation, sadness, loneliness. Things I used to smother with food the second they got uncomfortable. Now, instead of running from them, I let them sit with me for a bit. It wasn't fun, and it definitely wasn't easy, but it made me realize how much of my life I'd lived on mute. Feeling everything again, even the hard stuff, made me feel more alive than I'd expected. There were evenings when I'd come home after a rough day and automatically reach for the pantry, only to stop halfway. Not because I was forcing myself to, but because there was this moment of clarity where I could tell the difference between hunger and hurt. That tiny pause changed everything. It was like discovering I had a pause button for the first time in my life, and with it came a kind of freedom I didn't know I needed. My world started getting bigger again too. I started saying yes to small things. Coffee with a friend, a walk after dinner, sitting outside instead of scrolling my phone in the dark. None of it was dramatic, but each moment felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself I'd abandoned. There was a piece in me now that wasn't tied to progress, just presence. And honestly, the biggest change was realizing I didn't hate myself anymore. I didn't love myself all the time either, but the war inside me had quieted. I'd become someone who could sit with discomfort, who could feel things instead of numbing them, who could show up for himself even on days when nothing else made sense. But even then, I had no idea the next part of my journey would change me even more. When I think back to that night, the tightness in my chest, the fear I tried to shrug off, I realize it wasn't just a warning about my health. It was a warning about the way I'd been living. I'd been moving through life half awake, pretending everything was fine while carrying a weight that had nothing to do with my body. That moment didn't just shake me. It stripped away every excuse I'd been hiding behind. What changed me wasn't the fear of something happening to my heart. It was the realization that something already had. I'd stopped believing I was worth the effort. I'd stopped showing up for myself. And when that hit me, it felt like the ground shifted under my feet. Not in a dramatic way, but in a painfully honest one. I realized how much of my life I'd postponed, waiting for a version of me that never came. As I got healthier, I didn't feel fixed. I felt rebuilt. Not into someone new, but into someone I could finally recognize. Someone I didn't want to abandon anymore. I learned how to hear my emotions instead of trying to silence them. I learned how to sit with discomfort without running from it. And I learned that taking care of myself wasn't selfish. It was overdue. There are still days when I slip, when old habits try to claw their way back. But the difference now is that I don't disappear into them. I don't vanish into the numbness. I catch myself, not with judgment, but with a kind of compassion I never knew I could have for myself. And every time I do, it feels like proof that I made it out of a place I never thought I'd escape. So no, this isn't a story about losing weight. It's about finding the part of me I almost let go of. The part that believes I deserve to exist in my own life, fully and honestly. And when my heart warned me that night, it wasn't telling me I was dying. It was telling me to start living. If any part of my journey hit something in you, if it made you pause the way I once had to, then stay with me. Comment, share your own moment, and subscribe so we can walk through the rest of this together. Because trust me, this is still just the beginning.